There exists a peculiar moment in the human experience that defies every narrative we've been told about suffering. It arrives not with fanfare or drama, but with an eerie stillness that settles into your bones like winter fog. This isn't the breakdown everyone expects. No shattered dishes, no mascara-streaked cheeks, no desperate phone calls at 3 in the morning. Instead, it's something far more unsettling: the complete absence of emotional weather. You find yourself moving through days like a ghost, haunting your own life. The morning coffee still burns your tongue, but somehow the sensation feels distant, as if happening to someone else. Music that once moved you to tears now plays like elevator background noise. Conversations happen around you, through you, but rarely with the part of you that used to care about the outcome. You've become a master of appropriate responses: the well-timed nod, the expected smile, the practiced "I'm fine" that rolls off your tongue with disturbing ease. This is emotional numbness, and it's perhaps one of the most misunderstood states of human existence. Unlike depression's heavy blanket of sadness, or anxiety's electric panic, numbness offers something that feels almost like peace. Almost, because underneath that calm surface lies something far more complex, a sophisticated defense system that your mind has constructed not to punish you, but to preserve what's left of your emotional self. When therapists and researchers study emotional numbness, they often describe it as the mind's circuit breaker. Just as your home's electrical system will shut off power to prevent a fire when too much current flows through the wires, your emotional system will disconnect when the load becomes unbearable. It's not a malfunction, it's engineering. But here's what makes this particular form of protection so insidious. The very mechanism designed to save you from drowning in overwhelming emotions also cuts you off from the gentle currents of joy, wonder, and connection that make life worth living. The fortress you built to keep out the storm also blocks the sunrise. The neuroscience behind this phenomenon is both fascinating and sobering. When your brain perceives emotional threat, whether from trauma, chronic stress, repeated disappointment, or simply the accumulated weight of being human in a difficult world, it begins to alter the way it processes feelings. The amygdala, your brain's alarm system, becomes hypervigilant while simultaneously learning to muffle its own signals. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for emotional regulation, essentially puts itself on autopilot. What emerges is a person who can function, smile, work, and even laugh on cue, but who feels fundamentally disconnected from the source of their own vitality. They become skilled actors in the theater of their own lives, so convincing that sometimes even they forget they're performing. If you've ever felt this way, you're far from alone. Modern life seems almost designed to produce emotional numbness. We live in an age of constant stimulation yet profound disconnection, where we're expected to process more information, handle more stress, and maintain more relationships than any generation in human history. We're told to be resilient, productive, and perpetually positive, while simultaneously navigating political chaos, climate anxiety, economic uncertainty, and personal loss. The result is an epidemic of people who have learned to survive by feeling less. They're not necessarily depressed in the clinical sense. They can still get out of bed, go to work, maintain relationships, but they've traded emotional authenticity for emotional stability. And somewhere in that exchange, they've lost touch with the part of themselves that knows how to be truly alive. This numbness often develops so gradually that people don't notice it happening. It might start with a difficult period, a divorce, job loss, family crisis, or global pandemic. During these times, the ability to compartmentalize emotions feels like a superpower. You can handle whatever needs handling without falling apart. You become the rock that others lean on, the calm presence in the storm. But seasons change, crises pass, and the emergency emotional protocols remain active. What was once adaptive becomes restrictive. The temporary shutdown becomes a permanent state of being. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin to realize that you've been living life on mute. Behind nearly every case of emotional numbness lies a story of someone who once felt too much, too deeply, or for too long without adequate support or understanding. These are often the most sensitive souls, people who were born with their emotional nerve endings close to the surface, who noticed everything, remembered everything, felt everything. They might be the child who absorbed their family's unspoken anxieties, the teenager who carried their friends' problems as if they were their own, the adult who gave and gave until their own well ran dry. They're the helpers, the fixers, the ones who learned early that their value came from being strong for others, even when they were crumbling inside. Over time, these individuals develop what psychologists call emotional labor fatigue. They become experts at reading rooms, managing other people's feelings and maintaining harmony at the expense of their own emotional needs. Eventually, the system overloads. The heart that once felt everything begins to feel nothing, not as punishment but as preservation. This is why emotional numbness often puzzles those who experience it. They remember being passionate, empathetic, deeply moved by beauty and injustice alike. The absence of these feelings doesn't feel like relief. It feels like loss. They haven't become cold, they've become exhausted. What many people don't realize is that emotional numbness isn't just psychological, it's deeply physical. Emotions aren't abstract concepts. They're biochemical events that occur throughout your entire body. When you suppress these natural processes repeatedly, your body adapts in ways that can be felt long after the original emotional threat has passed. Chronic emotional suppression can manifest as persistent fatigue, difficulty concentrating, sleep disturbances, digestive issues, and a general sense of being disconnected from your physical self. Your body keeps the score, as trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk famously put it. And numbness is often your body's way of saying, I can't process any more right now. The vagus nerve, which connects your brain to your heart, lungs, and digestive system, plays a crucial role in this process. When it becomes dysregulated due to chronic stress or trauma, it can create a state where you feel simultaneously wired and tired, alert, yet disconnected. This is why people experiencing emotional numbness often describe feeling like they're watching their life through glass, physically present, but emotionally unreachable. Understanding this mind-body connection is crucial for healing, because it helps explain why willpower alone isn't enough to overcome numbness. You can't think your way out of a state that involves your entire nervous system. Recovery requires a more holistic approach that honors both the psychological and physiological aspects of emotional disconnection. One of the most challenging aspects of emotional numbness is that it often feels like wisdom. After years of being hurt by caring too much, investing too deeply, or hoping too hard, the ability to remain emotionally detached can seem like evolution rather than dysfunction. I'm just being realistic, people tell themselves. I'm protecting myself from disappointment. And there's truth in this. Emotional numbness does protect you from certain kinds of pain. You're less likely to be devastated by rejection, crushed by loss, or overwhelmed by injustice when your emotional volume is turned down. In the short term, it can feel like the most intelligent response to a world that seems designed to break sensitive hearts. But this protective mechanism comes with a hidden cost. It doesn't just shield you from negative emotions, it creates a blanket suppression that muffles everything. Joy becomes muted, love feels distant, beauty loses its impact, and even your own accomplishments feel hollow. You've gained protection but lost connection, not just to others, but to yourself. This is the cruel irony of emotional numbness. The very strategy you've used to avoid pain ends up creating a different kind of suffering. The existential ache of feeling like you're merely surviving, rather than truly living. You've traded the sharp pain of disappointment for the dull ache of disconnection. And while the latter might be more manageable, it's also more persistent. Perhaps one of the most isolating aspects of emotional numbness is how invisible it can be to others. Unlike more obvious forms of distress, numbness often hides behind a facade of competence and stability. The numb person becomes skilled at giving the appearance of emotional engagement, while feeling fundamentally disconnected from the experience. They laugh at jokes without finding them funny, offer comfort without feeling compassionate, and participate in celebrations without experiencing joy. They become emotional chameleons, reflecting back what they think others want to see while their own authentic feelings remain buried beneath layers of protective distance. This performance can be so convincing that friends and family often have no idea anything is wrong. You seem fine, they say, and technically, they're right. The numb person is functioning, meeting responsibilities, maintaining relationships, but functioning isn't the same as flourishing. And this distinction often goes unnoticed until someone finally finds the courage to say, I feel like I'm disappearing. The pressure to maintain this emotional performance can be exhausting. It requires constant vigilance, monitoring your responses, calibrating your reactions, ensuring that your emotional mask remains in place. Over time, this performance becomes so automatic that you might lose track of where the mask ends and your authentic self begins. Despite how permanent emotional numbness can feel, neuroscience offers profound hope. The brain's neuroplasticity, Its ability to form new neural pathways throughout life means that patterns of emotional suppression can be changed. The same brain that learned to protect itself through disconnection can learn to engage safely with feeling again. This process isn't about forcing emotions to return or pushing through numbness with sheer determination. Instead, it's about creating the conditions where your nervous system can begin to trust that feeling is safe again. This happens through consistent, gentle practices that signal to your brain that you're no longer in survival mode. Mindfulness practices, for example, help by teaching you to observe your internal experience without judgment. When you notice the absence of feeling without immediately trying to fix it, you begin to develop a different relationship with numbness itself. Instead of seeing it as a problem to be solved, you can start to understand it as information, your system's way of communicating its needs. Somatic therapies work directly with the body's stored responses to help discharge the energy that gets trapped when emotions are consistently suppressed. These approaches recognize that healing doesn't happen through talking alone, but through helping the nervous system complete the natural cycles of activation and rest that trauma and chronic stress can interrupt. The journey back to emotional aliveness rarely happens in dramatic moments of breakthrough. Instead, it typically occurs through an accumulation of small experiences that gradually convince your nervous system that it's safe to feel again. These moments might be subtle, noticing that a piece of music stirs something faint but real in your chest, finding yourself genuinely laughing at something silly, or feeling a brief moment of sadness without immediately pushing it away. These micro moments of emotional connection are incredibly precious because they represent your system's tentative steps back toward aliveness. They're often fragile and fleeting, which is why it's so important not to grab onto them too tightly or demand that they become bigger than they naturally are. Like tending a small flame, the key is to protect these moments without overwhelming them. Many people make the mistake of trying to accelerate this process by seeking out intense emotional experiences, watching sad movies to try to cry, or pursuing dramatic relationships to feel something. But numbness isn't usually healed by intensity, it's healed by safety. Your nervous system needs to trust that emotions won't overwhelm or destroy you before it will allow them to flow freely again. One of the most important shifts in recovering from emotional numbness is redefining what healing actually looks like. Our culture often presents healing as a return to a previous state of being, going back to who you were before you got hurt. But this model doesn't account for the reality that going through periods of numbness fundamentally changes you. True healing doesn't mean returning to your old sensitivity unchanged. It means integrating your experience of protection with your capacity for feeling, creating a more resilient form of emotional engagement. You're not trying to get back to being the person who felt everything all the time. You're becoming someone who can feel deeply when it's appropriate and protect yourself when necessary. Someone who has learned to choose their emotional investments more wisely. This process often involves grieving the part of yourself that you had to shut down to survive. There's real loss in emotional numbness, loss of time, experiences, connections, and parts of yourself that went underground. Acknowledging this loss without trying to immediately fix it is often an important part of the healing process. While the journey out of emotional numbness is ultimately internal, it rarely happens in isolation. Safe relationships, whether with friends, family members, therapists, or support groups, provide the external conditions that make internal healing possible. These relationships offer what psychologists call co-regulation, the ability to borrow stability and safety from another person's nervous system, while your own is learning to trust again. Safe relationships are characterized not by intensity or emotional demand, but by consistency and acceptance. They're relationships where you can be honest about your numbness without being pressured to feel differently, where your experience is witnessed without being judged or fixed. In these relationships, you can practice being authentic without performance, which slowly teaches your system that connection doesn't always require emotional labor. Sometimes the relationship that matters most is the one you develop with yourself. Learning to be compassionate toward your own numbness, to see it as an understandable response rather than a character flaw, can be profoundly healing. Self-compassion interrupts the cycle of shame that often keeps numbness in place, creating space for gentler forms of self-awareness to emerge. As counterintuitive as it might seem, there's often profound wisdom hidden within emotional numbness. Your system's decision to shut down emotionally wasn't random or pathological, it was intelligent. It represented your psyche's best attempt to preserve what was most essential about you when everything else felt threatened. This wisdom becomes more apparent as you begin to heal. You might notice that you've developed better boundaries, that you're less likely to take on other people's emotions as your own, or that you've become more discerning about where you invest your emotional energy. The same system that protected you through numbness can become a source of emotional intelligence and resilience. Many people discover that their experience with numbness has actually deepened their capacity for empathy. Having lived through the particular suffering of feeling disconnected from yourself, you develop a unique understanding of others who are struggling with their own forms of emotional pain. Your healing becomes not just personal, but potentially healing for others as well. Recovery from emotional numbness doesn't typically end with a return to your previous emotional baseline. Instead, it often results in a more nuanced and sustainable relationship with feeling altogether. You learn to surf emotional waves rather than being either overwhelmed by them or completely cut off from them. This might mean developing better skills for emotional regulation, learning to feel your feelings fully without being consumed by them. It might involve creating better life structures that prevent emotional overload in the first place. Most importantly, it usually involves learning to honor your emotional needs as legitimate and important, rather than seeing them as inconvenient or selfish. The goal isn't to become someone who never experiences emotional numbness again. Sometimes, temporary emotional protection is still appropriate and necessary. The goal is to develop choice in your emotional responses, the ability to open and close, to engage and withdraw, based on what the situation actually requires, rather than being stuck in a permanent state of disconnection. Perhaps most importantly, healing from emotional numbness is rarely a linear process with a clear endpoint. It's more like learning a new language, one that allows you to communicate with your own emotional experience in ways that feel safe and sustainable. Some days you'll feel more fluent than others. Some seasons will require more protection, others more openness. The key is developing trust in your own process and patience with your own timeline. Your numbness served you when you needed it, and your healing will unfold as you're ready for it. Neither state is permanent, and both can teach you something valuable about the complexity and resilience of the human heart. What matters most is not how quickly you recover, but how gently you treat yourself along the way. Because somewhere beneath the protective numbness, the part of you that knows how to feel deeply is still there, waiting for the right conditions to emerge again. And when it does, slowly, carefully, beautifully, you'll discover that you haven't just returned to feeling. You've learned to feel with wisdom, to love with boundaries, and to live with both protection and openness. That integration of numbness and feeling, protection and vulnerability, wisdom and wonder, represents one of the most profound forms of healing a human being can experience. It's not about choosing one side or the other, it's about learning to hold both, and in that holding, discovering a more complete version of who you were always meant to be.